Each year, City of Lenexa staff prepares a recommended operating budget, which is presented to the Mayor and City Council for consideration. The city's budget serves a crucial role that guides our efforts for the coming year. Over the next few months, the City Council will thoroughly review the recommended budget for 2025. This presentation offers an opportunity for you to explore what is under consideration and to gain insights into our proposed spending priorities for the next year.
We actively encourage residents to participate in the budget process by providing feedback and asking questions. You can email your questions to budget@lenexa.com or call 913-477-7544. We hope you will join us at our budget open house on August 15th at City Hall between 5 and 7 p.m. At this event, you can talk to us in person about the city's financial position and what's proposed in the 2025 budget.
This shows our agenda for this presentation. I'll begin by giving a high-level overview of the proposed budget before turning it over to CFO Nate Bloom for a more detailed look, as well as to review our longer-range financial forecasts with the proposed 25 budget assumptions included. The process of preparing a recommended budget for the city is lengthy and challenging. I always like to start by taking a moment to acknowledge the work of our talented finance team who lead this work for our organization. Thanks to CFO Nate Bloom, Assistant CFO Megan Sterling, and Senior Budget Analyst Coulter Stevenson in particular for their efforts. However, budget development also includes in-depth work by each department, and the product that we will discuss during today's presentation is very much a team effort by every department, so thanks to everyone involved. The process that leads to adoption of the budget each year begins with city staff developing a recommended budget. This presentation will provide an overview of the proposed budget for 2025. On July 9th, at a Committee of the Whole meeting, we will provide a more detailed overview of the budget, including any significant changes to each individual department's budget. Throughout all of these meetings and thereafter, we're happy to answer your questions and take your feedback on the recommended budget. All of this occurs before the recommended budget moves forward to a budget open house and to public hearings, where members of the public will have the opportunity to ask questions and provide feedback in person. We'll share the calendar for these meetings at the end of the presentation, but for anyone who has questions in the meantime, please feel free to submit those by email to budget@lenexa.com. Each year, the recommended budget is developed beginning in the spring, with staff's recommendations being finalized mid-year and the official budget being adopted in the fall. This means that we have to make certain assumptions and projections about how the city's finances will fare throughout the remainder of the current year. As Nate will talk about later in this presentation, we are conservative in those assumptions because it is always better to do better than expected than to do worse than expected and face budget shortfalls. With that in mind, I'd like to take a look at how we ended last year and what has happened so far in 2024 and the impact that has on our current year budget. So as you can see here, for fiscal year 23 year end, we experienced strong sales tax and use tax collections. And we also saw record revenue from building permits and investments. All the expenditures for fiscal year 2023 were within the 2023 budget, and we ended 2023 with general fund reserves of 48%. So far in 2024, sales and use tax, as well as franchise fee revenue, is down from prior years. We're definitely seeing a slowing in those areas. Our property tax revenue has returned to what are more historically normal valuation increases. And we're also seeing a more normal development activity this year. So we don't expect the record revenue from building permits that we experienced in fiscal year 2023. This slide shows a comparison from the fiscal year 24 adopted budget to the fiscal year 25 recommended budget. As you see, the total original budget for 2024 was just under $225 million, with $154.3 million in expenditures and $70.4 million in reserves. For FY25, the recommended budget is $246.7 million, with $168.3 million in expenditures and $78.4 million in reserves. A significant portion of the revenue increases that you see here are from special revenue and economic development funds. Special revenue funds are funds such as transient guest tax, which is collected on hotel motel stays, or special alcohol taxes. And those are restricted funds that can only be used for very specific purposes. Economic development funds, on the other hand, are largely pass-through dollars, which go to reimburse developers for eligible expenses pursuant to tax increment financing and community improvement district agreements. Growth in economic development funds does cause growth in our budget, as you can see here, but it also reflects growth in our community. And this ties directly back to one of the city's guiding principles, responsible economic development. This slide provides just a few highlights about the proposed budget. The total estimated assessed valuation for the city of Lenexa for 2025 is $1.82 billion. Assessed valuation grew by about $100 million, or approximately 5.8%. And of that, a significant portion of the increased valuation can be attributed to new construction and growth in the city over that time period. These numbers will not be final until October or November of this year, so we're working from estimated numbers at this point. The recommended mill levy in the 2025 budget is 26.97. That's a half mill reduction, and this is the 7th consecutive year that we have reduced the mill levy. Nate will show you a history of those rollbacks later in this presentation. Also, just to note here, property tax does account for about 43.3% of the city's total revenues. We continue to remain concerned as we consider the mill levy for 2025 about possible state legislative action that could negatively impact the city's budget in future years. So just this year in 2024, the Kansas legislature considered measures which would cap property evaluation increases and limit government competition. That bill was actually passed by the legislature and later vetoed by the governor. So these are concerns that could, if they would reappear in future years, negatively impact our budget. In addition, with the slowing of revenue that we're seeing so far this year and the continued workforce pressures that we have to recruit and maintain our high quality workforce, we believe that we can prudently do a half mill reduction, but that further mill levy reductions would be unwise at this time. Once again, we're recommending no changes to user fees, franchise fees, or the city's stormwater service charge. And we are recommending the addition of 5 full-time equivalents or 5 full-time employees for 2025. Those are detailed on page 13 of the budget document, but they include 2 positions in the police department, a police officer and an investigative specialist, 2 positions in the municipal services department, 1 facilities technician and 1 stormwater maintenance worker, and 1 position in parks and recreation, which will be a recreation specialist. This illustration shows you how you can calculate your city taxes. City taxes are only a portion of the total taxes that each resident pays. This is found on page 14 of the budget document. And the bottom line here is that the average resident pays $25.84 per month for each $100,000 in home valuation. Or the owner of an average Lenexa home will pay about $120.92 per month for all the services that they receive from the city of Lenexa. Here's a representative list of some of the services that you as residents receive for the $120.92 per month that you pay to the city in property taxes. This includes the care, maintenance, sweeping, and snow plowing of over 835 lane miles of roads, 175 miles of storm pipe, over 205 stormwater best management practices, 34 developed parks totaling 887 acres, 45 miles of trail, 3 outdoor pools. And that doesn't even include police and fire protection and the numerous other services and the facilities that are required to house all of those services. Our residents give us very high marks in citizen satisfaction surveys for the services that we as a city provide. In the 2023 Citizen Satisfaction Survey, we ranked above the national and regional averages in the vast majority of areas assessed in the survey. In addition, 95% of residents said that they were either satisfied or very satisfied with the overall quality of life in Lenexa, and 92% of residents reported being very satisfied or satisfied with the services the city provides. Lastly, 71% of residents felt satisfied or very satisfied with the value they receive for their tax dollar in Lenexa, which is 15 points over the Kansas and Missouri average and over 35 points above the national average. As I mentioned previously, city tax accounts for only a portion of your total property tax levy. And in 2023, city tax ranged from 23.5 to 26.3% of a resident's total property tax mill levy, depending upon which school district you were located. And in each case, the school levy, which is shown in red in these diagrams, accounts for the largest portion of the total property tax levy. And on these diagrams, the city's portion of the property taxes is shown in blue. Lastly, just a reminder that our governing body adopted these guiding principles, and they are used really by the city throughout every year to guide our work and throughout the budget, throughout the development of the budget. They're also reported on throughout the budget document itself. You can see alignment with these principles through key performance indicators and within the fund budgets. And we always keep these principles in mind as we're developing the budget. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to CFO Nate Bloom to go over the key elements of the recommended budget.
Thank you for that overview, Becky. Now we're going to discuss some of the key elements of the fiscal year 25 recommended budget, starting with our economic outlook. One of the first things that we do when we're putting together Lenexa's recommended budget is to look at the current status of the environment the city operates in. Looking back over the last few years, the economy has been nothing like we have seen before. The city and county as a whole experienced large property valuation increases, many over 10%, strong sales and use tax growth between 15 and 20%, and a very hot labor market with dramatic increases in the cost to retain and attract good employees. Additionally, the Federal Reserve rapidly increased interest rates to battle the highest inflation rate we have seen in over 40 years. Looking ahead, inflation remains elevated above the Federal Reserve's 2% target. The city continues to experience workforce pressures, especially in the area of public safety. There are challenges related to the municipal insurance market, as companies are no longer offering insurance to local governments, or if they do, they're at reduced coverage with increased premiums. Additionally, the historic revenue increases that the city has seen since the COVID-19 pandemic are leveling off and returning to their pre-COVID norms. With the rising costs for operations and revenue leveling off, the city is facing a challenging economic environment in 2025. So how do we successfully navigate a challenging environment while maintaining our commitment to provide exceptional public services? By sticking to our budget principles. These budget principles are the foundation for our fiscal year 25 recommended budget, and they are we fund ongoing operating expenditures with ongoing revenue sources. An example of this would be funding personnel costs, which are an ongoing expense, with sales tax revenue, which is an ongoing revenue source. We also use one-time revenues for one-time expenditures. An example of this would be the ARPA funding that the city received from the federal government, which we use to reconstruct the Lenexa Old Town Activity Center, a one-time expense. We also maintain sufficient reserve balances to address unforeseen events. The city must maintain these reserves so that we can navigate an economic downturn, such as the Great Recession, and still fund the necessary functions of the city. Additionally, we must maintain sufficient reserves so that we maintain our AAA bond rating, which saves taxpayers hundreds of thousands, if not millions, when the city issues debt to fund major capital projects. We also use a conservative approach to revenue estimating. Several of the city's revenue sources are very volatile and make up a significant portion of the budget, such as sales and use tax. As I mentioned before, the city experienced a 15 to 20% increase in this revenue source over the last couple of years. But in the first quarter of 2024, it is down a little over 2% overall. And then finally, the city prepares and funds equipment replacement, building maintenance schedules to predict future expenses and to make sure that we do not fall behind on our maintenance. Before we get into the numbers, I wanted to briefly touch on the mechanics of municipal budgeting. Per the balanced budget law, the city is required to adopt a budget that is balanced where total resources equal total obligations. Additionally, the city is required to budget our reserves as expenditures, even though the city does not anticipate spending these funds during the budget year. The city's budget is made up of several different funds, which are separate fiscal entities used to track specific revenues and expenditures associated with a particular purpose. An example of this would be the Rec Center Fund, which is funded from user fees, and the revenue can only be spent on the Rec Center operations or capital projects. Lenexa currently has 37 budgeted funds, and each of these funds fall into one of these categories: General Fund, Debt Service Fund, Special Revenue Funds, which are restricted, and in the case of TIF and CID funds, they are not revenue to the city. And then we have Enterprise Funds. A description of each of the categories is shown on the slide. General Fund is the principal fund of the city, which accounts for a majority of the city's operational expenditures. The Debt Service Fund is used to account for payment of principal and interest on the city's general obligation bonds. And special revenue funds are used to account for revenues derived from specific taxes, grants, or other revenues designed for particular functions or activities. And then enterprise funds are used to account for the operations financed and operated in a manner similar to private businesses. The intent is to provide goods or services to the general public on a continuing basis, primarily through user charges or user fees. Now we're going to start diving into the numbers for our fiscal year 25 recommended budget. This chart, the first column, shows the city's total recommended budget of $246.8 million. This includes the city's reserves, which are not planned to be spent in 2025, but we are required to budget as expenditures, and the city's economic development funds, which again are passed through and not necessarily revenue to the city. Since we do not intend to spend the city's reserve funds in 2025, the second column takes out our $78.5 million in reserves for a total of $168.3 million in total expenditures. Again, economic development funds are not revenue to the city. They are passed through to reimburse developers for eligible TIF or CID expenditures within the district. We take these funds out to show that the actual expenditures, operational expenditures for the city, total $145.3 million in 2025. So that is the money that the city budgets, plans to spend, and controls in the fiscal year 25 budget. This pie chart breaks out the city's total budget again, this time including reserves and economic development funds by category. As you can see, the city's special revenue funds that make up approximately 20% of the city's overall budget. As we mentioned before, these funds are either restricted or not revenue to the city. This chart is a breakdown of the city's general fund and compares to the fiscal year 25 recommended budget with the fiscal year 2024's adopted budget. Excluding reserves, the budget expenditures in the general fund are increasing 7.6%. In total, including reserves, the fund is increasing 8.7%. We'll go over the details of this increase during the remainder of the presentation. As Becky mentioned, we have included a $0.5 reduction in the city's tax rate in the fiscal year 25 budget. This is the seventh consecutive year the city has reduced its tax rate, and we anticipate further reductions in fiscal year 26. This budget does maintain sufficient general fund reserves for a AAA bond rating, as well as the uncertain economy looking ahead. We continue to focus on providing high-quality city services, and to do that, we have to retain good employees and fund strategic priorities. And again, this budget also plans for economic pressures, workforce, inflation, and the possibility of a recession and economic downturn in the near future. The total fiscal year 25 recommended expenditure budget is $168.3 million, which is an increase of $14.2 million or 9.1% compared to the fiscal year 24 original budget of $154.3 million. Again, if we take out economic development funds, the expenditure budget is $145.3 million, which is an increase of $9.3 million or 6.8% compared to the fiscal year 24 original budget of $136 million. Total general fund operating expenditures in the fiscal year 25 budget are $114.2 million. This is an increase of $7.7 million or 7.2% compared to fiscal year 24. As Becky mentioned, we are adding 5 new FTEs for a total FTE count of 565.88 FTE in fiscal year 25. Again, the estimated mill levy is for 2025 is 26.970 mills, reduction of a half mill, and as Becky mentioned, stormwater service charge and all other fees stay the same. Now we'll look at the city's major revenue sources. The first major revenue source of the city is property tax revenue. In order to calculate the city's estimated property tax revenue for 2025, We take the city's assessed valuation received from Johnson County times the city's tax rate or mill levy. For the 2025 budget, Lenexa's assessed valuation increased 5.8% to $1.82 billion versus the $1.72 billion in 2024. As I mentioned before, the city has experienced significant increases in assessed valuation in the years following the COVID-19 pandemic, but this 5.8% increase for 2025 is more in line with normal pre-pandemic increases. This chart details the city's mill levy from 2016 to our estimated mill levy of 26.970 mills in 2025. And again, this is the city's 7th consecutive mill levy decrease since 2018. The Kansas State Legislature required the city to calculate its revenue neutral rate. And if the city plans to exceed the revenue neutral rate, it must hold a public hearing. The definition of a revenue neutral rate is the mill levy required to raise the same amount of property tax revenue as the prior year using current year assessed valuation amounts. Based on the city's assessed valuation from Johnson County of $1.82 billion, the city's revenue neutral rate is 25.872 mills. This would be a reduction of 1.598 mills from the current 2024 tax rate and a further reduction of 1.098 mills from the 2025 recommended tax rate of 26.970 mills. The dollar value of these reductions is 2.82 from the reduction of the current 2024 tax rate, and it'd be 1.93 million further reduction from the recommended 2025 tax rate of 26.97 mills. So what are the impacts of the increase in assessed valuation and the half mil reduction to the tax rate? The city's estimated property tax revenues are projected to increase by 3.9% to $47.5 million versus the $45.7 million in fiscal year 2024, assuming a delinquency rate of 3%. Property tax revenue is estimated at $39 million in the general fund and $8.5 million in debt service fund for fiscal year 25. Another major revenue source for the city is sales tax. The city currently has a 1 3/8 cent sales tax, which is estimated to generate $36.9 million in fiscal year 25, which is up 2% from the original budget for 2024 and up 1% from the 2024 reestimate. I will note that the fiscal year 24 reestimate is flat compared to the actual collections in fiscal year 23. The estimated fiscal year 25 use tax revenue in the city's general fund is approximately $16 million, which is up 9% from the fiscal year 24 original budget of $14.7 million and up 2% from the fiscal year 24 re-estimate of $15.7 million. Motor vehicle excise tax is payable at the time of application for the registration of a vehicle and must be renewed annually. The estimated fiscal year 25 revenue from the motor vehicle taxes is $3.3 million, which is an increase of approximately 4% over the fiscal year 24 original budget, $3.16 million. The stormwater capital charge is included on a property owner's annual tax bill, and the funds are used to expand the city's stormwater system. The estimated fiscal year 25 revenue from the stormwater service charge is $6.63 million, which is up 2.6% from the fiscal year 24 original budget of $6.46 million. So in total, revenue for the fiscal year 25 budget equals $169.3 million. Of that, over 43% of the city's revenue comes from property taxes and 42.5% comes from non-property taxes, which include sales and use tax. Now let's look at our expenditure projections for the fiscal year 25 budget. Personnel costs are one of the city's largest expenses. Staff has received direction from the council to not fall behind on compensation and benefits. This recommended budget includes a 6% employee compensation increase or adjustment, which 3% or half of it is reserved in our non-departmental fund and will be allocated at a future date. City contributions for employee health insurance increased by 11% or $870,000 from $7.62 million in fiscal year 24 to $8.49 million in 2025. Again, we're adding 5 new FTEs for total budgeted full-time equivalent positions of 565.88 in 2025. Fiscal year 2025 contractual services and commodity expenditures are at $18.5 million in the general fund compared to $17.7 million in the fiscal year 24 budget. The fiscal year 25 increase of $800,000 is 4.5% over the 2024 budget. The fiscal year 2025 capital outlay expenditures are $880,000 in the general fund compared to $700,000 for the fiscal year 24 budget, which is a 2.6% increase. The city continues to experience lingering issues related to delivery of critical equipment, something that started during the COVID-19 pandemic. Currently, the wait for a new fire apparatus is almost 5 years after the city places the order. The fiscal year 2025 economic development payments, which include CIDs, neighborhood revitalization districts, special benefit districts, and TIF, are $28.4 million compared to $23 million for the fiscal year 24 budget. The increase of $5.4 million, or approximately 23.5%, is primarily due to new economic development happening in several of the districts. A majority of this revenue, again, is received in these funds, are passed through, and are not revenue to the city. The general fund transfer to the CIF for pavement management program is $1.4 million for 2025. That's approximately equivalent to 0.78 mils, compared to $1.3 million in fiscal year 24, which is a 7.7% increase. The general fund also is budgeted transfers to the equipment reserve fund, increased to $2.5 million in fiscal year 25, compared to $1.95 million in 2024. The general fund transfer to the rec center is $300,000 compared to $500,000 in 2024. Total expenditures in the fiscal year 25 budget are $168.3 million. Public safety is the largest share at $39 million, or 23%. So now we'll turn our attention to a multi-year financial forecast. The city puts together a multi-year financial forecast for each of its funds. However, we focus mainly on the city's general fund, debt service fund, and stormwater fund, as these funds make up approximately 70% of our total budget. Some of the assumptions included in our 5-year financial model are assessed valuation increases of 4% in fiscal year 26 through 2029. This is a conservative estimate, as the city has had 11 years in a row where the increase has been over 5%. Sales and use tax is projected to increase 2% annually from fiscal year 2026 through 2029. And we project employee compensation increases to be 4% from 26 through 2029. This chart shows the general fund, and it's modeled for the life of the financial forecast. It's structurally balanced with a slight increase to fund balance in fiscal year 26 through 2029. General fund reserves are projected to be between 35 and 37% through the life of the forecast. Per policy, the reserve balance of the general fund should have a balance between 30 and 35% of revenues. However, in order to maintain our AAA bond rating and to plan for possible economic downturn, staff anticipates keeping the reserve balance just over the max percentage. Due to a positive outcome in fiscal year 2023, the general fund reserve balance ended the year at $48.5 million, or 48% of revenues. Staff is recommending that $8 million of the general fund reserve be allocated to the capital improvement fund in order to bring the reserve balance closer to the max target of 35% of revenues. This will allow the city to cash finance several capital projects and save taxpayer money by not having to issue debt to pay for these projects. The debt service fund is also structurally balanced through the life of the forecast. The city is building up reserves in the debt service fund to pay for major capital projects included in the financial model and some that are on the horizon. A few of these major capital projects are 83rd Street Phase 1 and 2, Fire Station 6, Old City Hall construction, and then the possibility of a Lone Elm interchange. The stormwater fund is also structurally balanced through the life of the forecast. The stormwater capital charge will remain at $109 per EDU in fiscal year 25. This slide shows the next steps in the city's budget process. We would like to invite you to come to the city's open house on the fiscal year 25 budget, provide staff with feedback on how to allocate the city's resources. The open house will take place on August 15th at the lobby of City Hall between 5 and 7 p.m.